23rd of March, 1943, the Tunisian desert outside El Guettar does not welcome men. It burns them by day and freezes them by night, and on this particular morning, it did both within the same hour, because the sun had not yet climbed high enough to matter, and the German panzers were already rolling. Sergeant Aleksy Nowak, a Polish-born legionnaire, who had already survived the fall of France, the retreat through Senegal, and 2 separate wars before this one, lay in a scrape of rock above the valley and watched the young Americans below him prepare to meet steel with nothing but rifles, mines, and a stubbornness nobody had told them they were allowed to have. He had seen green troops break before. He expected to see it again. He did not. "I had buried better soldiers than these boys," he wrote afterward, in a letter that survived the war though its recipient did not. "I did not expect to be watching them still standing by nightfall." That single sentence contains the entire mystery of this story, because in the official memory of the Second World War, the war that Hollywood built and popular history repeated until it hardened into fact, the American soldier arrives fully formed, confident, capable, ready. The truth, told by the men least inclined to flatter anyone, was far less comfortable and far more human. The finest infantry the United States would field in the European theater, the division that would one day storm Omaha Beach, was first judged not by its own generals, not by the enemy, but by a handful of exhausted, unimpressed, battle-hardened legionnaires, who had every reason to write these Americans off entirely. Instead, over 4 brutal months in North Africa, something else happened. The men who trusted nothing began, slowly and against their own instincts, to trust the Big Red One. To understand how that happened, we have to go back to November of 1942, to a landing nobody in the Foreign Legion asked for, and almost nobody there wanted to believe would matter. When American forces came ashore near Oran, as part of Operation Torch, the French soldiers waiting for them were not allies yet. They were, technically, the enemy, wearing the uniform of a government that had signed an armistice with Germany 2 years earlier. Among those French forces stood units of the Foreign Legion, men who belonged to no single nation and answered to none of the sentiments driving the war around them, only to the regiment and to each other. Many of these legionnaires were themselves refugees from the very fight the Americans were arriving late to join. Spanish Republicans who had lost their own war, Russians who had lost an empire, Germans and Austrians who had lost their country to a man they despised more than any Frenchman ever could. Poles like Nowak who had watched his homeland fall in 6 weeks in 1939 and had spent every day since waiting for a chance to make somebody pay for it. These were not soldiers easily moved by uniforms or flags. They had learned, at terrible cost, exactly what raw courage was worth against machine guns, and exactly how little it mattered without discipline, artillery, and officers who understood the ground. So when the fighting in Oran ended within days and French North Africa turned its rifles toward Germany instead, the legionnaires who now found themselves alongside American units did not celebrate a friendship. They conducted an inspection. And the early results did not flatter the newcomers. The first real test came in December, at a ridge the British called Longstop Hill, a height that commanded the whole approach into the Medjerda Valley. American infantry from the 18th Regiment of the 1st Infantry Division were thrown into the fighting there, tired, undersupported, and unfamiliar with the terrain. They were pushed off the hill. 356 casualties for a piece of ground they did not hold by nightfall. Word of it traveled fast through the French lines, and it traveled the way bad news always does among professional soldiers. Without cruelty, but without mercy either. Before we go further into what these Americans would become, take a moment now, if this hidden history is new to you, to follow the channel Sam, World War II, so the rest of these forgotten stories find you when they are told. A Legionnaire captain serving nearby summarized the mood in a report that has survived in regimental archives. "They fight with their hearts before their heads," he wrote of the Americans. "Hearts do not hold ridges, not yet." It was not contempt exactly. It was something colder and more clinical. The assessment of craftsmen watching apprentices, aware that the apprentices would either learn or die, and genuinely unsure which. The Legionnaires had no obligation to like the Americans. They had only an obligation to survive beside them, and in the North African winter of 1942, survival was not yet something anyone was prepared to bet on the newcomers providing. 2 men, on opposite sides of that judgment, deserve to be named, even though history mostly forgot both of them. Corporal Walter Hale grew up on a wheat farm outside a small town in Kansas, the kind of place where the horizon is the only thing bigger than the sky. He had never left his home state before the army sent him to Britain, and he had never left Britain before a troop ship put him ashore in Algeria with a rifle he had fired perhaps 40 times in training. He was 20 years old. He wrote to his mother that the desert reminded him of nothing on earth he had ever seen, and that the French soldiers he met looked at him the way his father looked at a new hired hand, waiting to see if the work got done before deciding whether the wages were worth it. Sergeant Aleksy Nowak was, by comparison, ancient in every way that mattered. 29 years old, but a veteran of the defense of Poland in 1939, a survivor of the chaos that followed, and a Legionnaire since 1940. He had lost a brother at the Bzura River and had not spoken of it since. He trusted very little, and what he did trust, he trusted absolutely, having learned the difference the hardest possible way. When his unit, the 4th Demi-Brigade of the Foreign Legion, was pulled from garrison duty in West Africa and shipped north to join the fight in Tunisia, he did not expect the Americans fighting alongside French forces to change his opinion of them. He simply intended to do his job and bury whoever needed burying, French, American, or otherwise. These two men never formally met, so far as any surviving record shows, but their units would occupy the same stretch of Tunisian ground within weeks of each other, and their stories, followed side by side, tell us something the history books left out. Not because it was hidden deliberately, but because it did not fit the story America wanted to tell about itself. The story America wanted was one of instant competence. The story the Legionnaires actually witnessed was one of failure, humiliation, and then, slowly, earned respect. The second story is better. It is also true. The failure came first, and it came hard. In the middle of February 1943, German armor under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel struck through the Kasserine Mountain Pass and tore into inexperienced American units with a speed and violence that stunned everyone watching, allies and enemies alike. Tanks were lost by the dozen. Positions collapsed faster than orders could be issued to hold them. Soldiers who had never faced a panzer in their lives found themselves facing 40 at once, and many broke. Not from cowardice, but from the simple, brutal fact that nothing in their training had prepared them for what combat against a first-rate mechanized army actually felt like. Nowak's unit was not directly engaged at Kasserine itself, but the retreat washed past them, and what the Legionnaires saw did nothing to improve their opinion. Trucks moving the wrong direction. Wounded men with a look in their eyes that veterans recognized instantly and never forgot once they had seen it themselves. A young American lieutenant, separated from his company, asking a French sergeant in broken phrasebook French which way was safe, and receiving an answer that was not encouraging. "We had thought perhaps the training was the problem," Nowak wrote later. "After Kasserine, we wondered if it was something deeper, whether the whole army was simply not yet a real army. It is a harsh judgment, and an unfair one in hindsight, but it was the honest judgment of men who had bled for every inch of expertise they possessed, and who could not yet see what a modern industrial nation, given a few brutal months to learn, was capable of becoming. What the Legionnaires did not know, because nobody could have known it yet, was that Kasserine was not the character of the American army. It was its childhood, and childhood's end. The response to the disaster was immediate and unforgiving in exactly the way the Legionnaires would have approved of, had they been consulted. Command of the American forces changed hands. Discipline tightened. Officers who had failed were removed, sometimes within days, and replaced by men with a very different temperament, chief among them a cavalry officer named George Patton, whose obsession with appearance, punctuality, and aggression struck the surviving French officers as almost comically severe, right up until they noticed it was working. Supply lines were reorganized. Artillery coordination, badly lacking during the Kasserine fighting, became a point of near-fanatical emphasis. The soldiers who had run in February were, in most cases, the same soldiers who would stand a month later. What had changed around them was everything else. Before El Guettar became the proving ground, there was Ousseltia, a quieter sector to the north where American units, including elements of the 1st Infantry Division, were sent to reinforce the thin French line still recovering from the winter fighting. It was here, in the weeks after Kasserine, that the real education began. Not in some single dramatic battle, but in the grinding, unglamorous routine of shared trenches, shared patrols, and shared cold nights on a mountainside that offered neither side any comfort. The Legionnaires, professional to the bone, watched everything. They watched how the Americans dug in, sloppily at first, then with growing care once a patrol took losses to a mortar barrage that better entrenchment would have softened. They watched how quickly the young corporals adapted, faster than most European conscripts would have, because these were men raised on farms and in factories, comfortable with tools and machinery and the blunt logic of fixing what was broken. Walter Hale's own letters describe a French sergeant, almost certainly not Nowak himself, but a man very much like him, correcting his foxhole angle without a word of shared language, simply by kneeling down, redigging 6 inches of it, and walking away. He never said if it was good enough, Hale wrote, but he stopped fixing it after that. I decided that was the compliment. It was in these small, unrecorded exchanges, not in any official communique, that the true hinge of this story turns. Historians who write about the Tunisian campaign tend to focus on the maps, the divisions, the dates. They rarely mentioned the foxholes, the shared cigarettes, the silent corrections passed between men who did not speak each other's language but understood with total clarity the only language that mattered in that landscape, which was competence. A Legionnaire captain, reflecting years afterward, put it plainly. "We did not train them," he said. "We simply stopped correcting them, one habit at a time, until there was nothing left to correct." That sentence is, in many ways, the truest measure of respect a professional soldier can offer another. Not praise, not friendship. Silence, where correction used to be. By the second week of March, patrols that had once been led exclusively by French non-commissioned officers were being shared equally. American mortar teams were adjusting fire using French spotting techniques, passed hand-to-hand across a language barrier that mattered less with every passing day. The apprenticeship, brutal and unspoken, was ending. What came next would decide whether it had actually worked. To understand why Guettar became the moment everything turned, it helps to understand what the American Army had actually fixed since February, because the changes were neither cosmetic nor accidental. The disaster at Kasserine had exposed 3 specific failures, and the reorganization under the new command addressed each of them with almost surgical precision. The first failure was fragmentation. American units at Kasserine had often been scattered piecemeal to reinforce whatever section of the line looked weakest, which meant no single formation ever fought at full strength, and none could mass the firepower needed to stop a concentrated panzer thrust. After the reorganization, the 1st Infantry Division was kept together as a coherent fighting force, allowed to train, resupply, and operate as a single instrument rather than a collection of borrowed parts. The second failure was artillery coordination. European veterans, the Legionnaires among them, had spent years learning that infantry without properly synchronized artillery support was simply infantry waiting to die. American gunnery crews absorbed this lesson at brutal speed during the weeks at Ousseltia, and by March their fire discipline had improved to a degree that surprised even the French officers observing them. The third failure was psychological, and it is the hardest to measure but perhaps the most important. At Kasserine, American soldiers had faced panzers for the first time and did not yet believe in their bones that a tank could be stopped. Belief is not a small thing in combat. An anti-tank gun crew that believes its weapon works fights differently than one that secretly suspects it does not. The weeks of shared positions with the Legion, watching hardened veterans treat panzer assaults as a serious but entirely survivable problem rather than an unstoppable catastrophe, did something training manuals alone could never have accomplished. It rebuilt the belief. By the 23rd of March, when General Erich von Broich's 10th Panzer Division moved to counterattack the American position at Guettar, the force it met bore only a surface resemblance to the one that had broken at Kasserine 6 weeks earlier. Same insignia, same young faces mostly. A completely different army underneath. The ground at Guettar is a wide flat basin ringed by hills, a place that offers no cover to the men fighting across it, and no mercy to the machines fighting over it either. American forces had pushed through the town in the middle of March, opening the route east, after a nighttime raid by Rangers and mortarmen that caught the defending Italian units completely unprepared. It was the first clean success for the American Army since the disaster in February, and everyone involved understood exactly how much weight that first success was carrying. Then came the counterattack. Sergeant Nowak's demi-brigade held ground on the flank of the American position, close enough to watch the battle unfold and, when the fighting shifted, close enough to become part of it. He described the opening of the German assault in language stripped of all ornament, the way soldiers describe the moments that matter most. "The tanks came like a wall that moved," he wrote. "We had seen this wall before. We had seen it break infantry that did not know how to stand against it. This time the wall did not break what it struck. American gun crews dug in and camouflaged along the high ground, held their fire until the panzers closed to ranges that made every shell count, exactly as they had been taught in the weeks since Kasserine, exactly as the Legionnaires beside them had insisted was the only way the tactic actually worked. Artillery, coordinated now with a precision that would have been unthinkable in December, began falling on the German formations before they could fully deploy. Tank destroyers moved by platoon rather than by scattered section, and the infantry, Walter Hale's regiment among them, held their positions through an assault that, 6 weeks earlier, would very likely have sent them running. It did not go perfectly. Nothing in war ever does. Positions were lost and retaken. Casualties mounted through the long afternoon, and at least one American company was nearly overrun before reinforcements, moving with a speed that surprised the Legionnaires watching from the flank, restored the line. But when the panzers finally withdrew, having lost roughly 30 tanks in the attempt and gained no meaningful ground, something had changed that no communiqué needed to spell out. Nowak crossed part of the battlefield that evening, helping locate wounded before the light failed completely. He found Hale's platoon still holding the ridge they had been ordered to hold that morning, exhausted, filthy, missing men, but in position. The two soldiers exchanged no words that either ever recorded, only, according to Hale's own later account, a look and a shared cigarette passed hand to hand across the remains of a shattered stone wall. "I did not think of them as boys anymore," Nowak wrote in the letter he sent home that week, the same letter that opened this story. "I had buried better soldiers than these. I did not expect to be watching them still standing by nightfall. I was wrong to doubt them, and I say that plainly, because a soldier who cannot admit an error of judgment about the men beside him does not deserve to survive the next battle." It is by any measure one of the more remarkable compliments recorded in the entire North African campaign, precisely because of who paid it. Not a general writing for the historical record, not a politician building a myth for the newsreels back home. A tired, grieving, deeply skeptical professional soldier, writing home in private, with no reason whatsoever to flatter anyone. What became of the men themselves reflects the uneven, often unjust way this kind of history gets remembered afterward. The 1st Infantry Division went on to fight in Sicily that summer, then spent nearly a year training in Britain before landing on Omaha Beach on the 6th of June 1944, a name that would eventually eclipse every earlier battle the division had fought, including the one that had actually taught it how to win. Walter Hale survived Guettar and Sicily both. His later record grows harder to trace, as so many ordinary soldiers' records do, but a final letter placed him still with his regiment in England in the spring of 1944, waiting for an invasion everyone knew was coming, and nobody could yet imagine the true cost of. The 4th Demi-Brigade of the Foreign Legion did not follow the Americans to France. Its Tunisian veterans were folded into new formations as the French army reorganized for the fighting still ahead, some eventually serving in the Italian campaign, others scattered across a war that would not end for either France or its legion for years after Germany's own surrender. Sergeant Aleksy Nowak's name appears in regimental rolls through the middle of 1943, and then, like so many others swallowed by a war too large to track every soldier individually, fades from the available record. Whether he survived the war entirely is, as of this telling, simply unknown. One more small silence in an archive full of them. What is not unknown, because it survives in the letters, the reports, and the regimental histories that outlasted the men who wrote them, is the judgment itself. Hardened professional soldiers, men who had every reason and every right to dismiss green American troops as an unproven liability, watched those troops fail catastrophically, watched them rebuild themselves in a matter of weeks, and then watched them hold a line against German armor that had broken far more experienced armies on other continents. That transformation, documented not by American propaganda, but by the sworn skeptics standing beside it, is a truer measure of what the United States Army became in North Africa than any newsreel of the era ever offered. It is also a story that popular history quietly dropped, for reasons that have less to do with importance and more to do with narrative convenience. Stories are easier to tell when competence arrives fully formed. Kasserine complicates the myth of the effortlessly capable American soldier, and Guettar, coming so soon afterward, gets folded into a broader arc that skips the humiliation and jumps straight to the redemption, as though the redemption required no witnesses at all. But it did require witnesses. It required men like Aleksy Nowak, who doubted, who watched, and who eventually wrote down, honestly and without flattery, exactly what he saw change in front of him. Return for a moment to that ridge above Guettar, to a Polish sergeant lying in the rocks at dawn, watching young men from Kansas and a dozen other places he had never heard of prepare to meet German armor, with mines, rifles, and a stubbornness they had not yet earned the right to feel confident about. He expected, based on everything his own war had taught him, to watch it fail. He watched instead the slow, unglamorous, thoroughly unmythical process of an army learning, in real time, under fire, how to become the force that would eventually help end the war in Europe. There was no single dramatic turning point in that transformation, no cinematic speech, no perfect battle plan unveiled at the decisive hour. There was only a series of small corrections, a foxhole dug 6 inches deeper, an artillery barrage timed a few seconds more precisely, a line held 1 more hour than it had been held the time before, repeated by exhausted young men until the men correcting them stopped finding anything left to correct. The legionnaires who witnessed it did not do so as friends, and they did not do so as propagandists. They did so as professionals grading the work of other professionals, in the harshest classroom the 20th century had yet produced. And when the grading was finished, the verdict, delivered not in a headline but in a private letter never meant for publication, stands as one of the most honest tributes the American soldier ever received. Not that he arrived a hero. He did not. He arrived frightened, undertrained, and badly beaten, exactly as any nation's first untested soldiers arrive. What he became, in the space of a single North African winter, watched the whole time by men who had absolutely no reason to lie about what they saw, is the story history mostly chose to forget. It should not have, because the truest compliment any soldier can receive is not that he was born capable. It is that the men who doubted him most watched him earn it.